All right, so office leases. So we own a fair amount of office buildings and we've been pretty successful at the office space. So I think one of the big things that spook people is just general vacancy and demand for offices, right? So you got to worry about TI and lease up period. That plays a role. Also forward looking, bigger office buildings with the impact of AI and reducing some of the staff will be a role. But right now we're just going to primarily talk about office leases and how to make those deals work. Right? So when it comes to analyzing office leases, you kind of have a broad spectrum. So you go from a fully gross lease, when that means that the tenant pays $2,000 a month, that's all they pay. That typically includes their utilities, it includes water sewer, it includes common area, everything that's associated with it. The tenant just pays one flat figure, and that's the amount, and the landlord is responsible for everything else. That's gross lease. On the other end of the spectrum is a triple net lease. That means that the landlord or the tenant pays for everything. So the tenant pays rent, they pay real estate taxes, insurance, utilities, any kind of structural pieces that are necessary of the property. HVAC goes out, they're responsible for it. Roof issue, they're responsible for it. Tenant's responsibility for all repairs that are associated with that property. So those are the ends of the spectrum. And then there's lots of room in the middle for additional leases. So if we start back at gross, where the tenant only pays one fee and the landlord's responsible for everything. Coming in from that, you have what's called modified gross. Modified gross lease is when there is a set lease rate, and then there's what's called a base year. So right now, if we did a new lease today, it's 2025, their base year would be 2025. So if the real estate taxes on that building are $10,000 and the insurance on that building are $5,000, well, any increase in future years, the tenant would be responsible for their pro rata share. So if they have half the building, they'd be responsible for half the increase after that base year. So if in 2026, real estate taxes go to $20,000, well, there'd be a $10,000 difference between those 2 years. The tenant has half of the building, they'd be responsible for $5,000 in additional payment, including in their rent. So that's a big piece, right? That's modified gross. Modified gross base year, any increase past that base year, the tenant's responsible for their portion of that increase. After that, you start running into more of what's called a net lease, where the tenant is responsible for all of the expense associated with that space, but it's primarily related to just real estate taxes, insurance, common area fees, and utilities. So they pay the rent and they're responsible for either paying those expenses directly or their pro rata share of the increased expenses. And then there are levels of net lease in which certain items are responsible for the tenant on the structural basis. So you could have more of a double net lease, which would include HVAC and general repairs, but maybe not structural repairs like roof, gutters, maybe parking lot. So there's some wiggle room between the two bookends on that spectrum, and it's kind of right here. But knowing the type of leases and how to structure those leases are where a lot of money is either made or lost, because you can get quite a bit of reimbursement from the tenants with how you structure the leases in that middle ground, specifically on the modified gross side and what level of reimbursement they're responsible for. And it reduces the risk of the building owner substantially because it limits the operating expense increases over time. So understanding the lease types, and when you're buying a building, understanding what the landlord is specifically responsible for and the tenant is specifically responsible for, and setting up your procedures so that you are getting all of the reimbursements that you are due from the tenant is critical to maximizing the value of the building.